Welcome to the Curi0stiy Show. We are so excited today because we are interviewing Reverend Jim Raistrick. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Dale. Thanks, Cheryl.
Our pleasure, Jim. And I was looking forward to today's interview until I found out that you're in a lovely warm environment up at Surfers Paradise. How dare you?
Yeah, it's terrible. Some of us have to suffer through in hospitable circumstances like this, and I'm one of them.
I love it. Now, Jim, I met you through Light FM. You've had an illustrious career. Would you like to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Where do you want me to start? So, yes, we did meet in at Light FM, or Positive Media, 89.9 The Light. That's where I was from 2014 and up until the start of this year, which was 2022. So that's a few years. I spent some time in television as well on God TV. As a general manager and operations manager, and most recently I was the business development executive there as well. So that's what I had been doing and for Christian media. So yeah. I want to tell you about the rest of the things that I've done. Is that what you're hinting at?
Yes, go.
About why there's this little thing up here. Where is it? That way, over there, and these other things over here. So, yes, I was in the military. I was in the Army. I was a Green Beret in the Australian Commando Unit in 1993 to 93. I was a real estate agent for 13 years. And, I became Christian while I was a real estate agent. I sold my agency and I went back to university and got degrees. And hence I'm wearing this funny little thing that looks a bit like a tie, but not really now. So I'm an Anglican priest. And that's what I've been for a number of years now.
That's fascinating. I'm really curious here regarding that transition from real estate agent to Anglican priest. What was it about real estate that you start to transition your thinking and beliefs?
Well, it's an interesting story, but that's probably take the entire part of our Curi0stiy show talking about that. You can, if you really want to hear about my conversion story, find it on Spotify. If you do a search on my name, it's a 3-part series where I was interviewed about how I came to faith through that circumstance. But I think it's actually got something to do with as a real estate agent has a lot of time on their hands. And you are dealing with people in ways that it's almost like a crisis type event. So time on your hands, lots of crisis. That does tend to give you a lot of time to think about things. And I think that's perhaps how I came through that.
That's interesting because when we think of, purchasing homes or selling a home, there's so many different reasons behind that, and it's not always a pleasant one, is it? So no. the circumstances that people are dealing with, and as a real estate agent having to manage that would require tremendous skill sets and empathy.
You would think so. Unfortunately, what tends to happen, particularly in boom times, is people get so enticed and attracted by the money that you can make. And I have to admit, even when I began my time as a real estate agent in 2000, was because I got taken advantage of in a really bad financial real estate deal. And it made me so angry that I quit what I was doing and became a real estate agent. Because it occurred to me that this gentleman had told me less than truths and told the person who was selling the property to me less than truths. And when we finally did get to meet each other, and worked out what had happened to us both, we thought, geez, he's just got a whole lot of money from us, which he would have got anyway. He didn't need to tell us a whole lot of fibs. He could have just been honest, and we would have, he would have still sold the property. I would have still bought the property. He could have done that, and he didn't need to do all these gymnastics with the truth that he was doing, and he still would have got paid. But yeah, and so I sort of got into real estate for that reason. I thought, look, why don't we just honestly do what we're getting paid to do? Why don't we just do that? And yes, I was quite successful in it. So yeah.
So would you say that your anger at the immorality of Australia
injustice
drove you to being a priest?
I don't really think so. That'd be a pretty long bow to pull. I don't know that actually got me, but I do have a sense of I don't like injustice. I don't know anybody really does. Even those people who perpetuate injustice. but typically people will say, I don't like bullies. And that to me says something to do with injustice. Injustice is really important, and we do need to stand up for those people who can't stand up for themselves. So, yeah.
Just for clarity there, I heard priest. Can you give me the distinction between priest and minister?
Well, a priest is a minister of religion, so that is the same thing, but there is various different titles. So Anglicans and Roman Catholics and Orthodox faiths or Christian faiths have priests. Baptists and Pentecostals, they tend to have pastors. They are different roles. In the Anglican denomination, there are various different ranks. So you have the laity, which is everybody who's not taken holy orders. You have deacons and priests who are clergy, and then you have bishops who have they are the bishopric, which is the other part of it. So there's 3 different spheres. So yeah, does that help? Not really.
No, look, it's a good start, and I think this is one of the elements, isn't it, that there is so much education to be had around understanding faith and its various nuances. That, the expertise that you have in terms of what it is that you do in your role, but also preparation for that is relatively unknown to so many.
Yeah, and that's probably what happened to me when I had my coming to faith experience. I simply wanted to know everything. And I wanted to know it so badly that I sold my agency and went to uni to try and find that out. Because I thought, look, I know these things to be true now. I've had these experiences. I really want to know what's going on, and I want to know what I believe, and I want to know what I don't believe, and I want to know why I don't believe that and why I do believe that. And so that ended up me getting a Master's of Theological Studies after what was 10 odd years, 12 years. So yeah.
So Jim, our topic today is identity. So how would you say that your identity changed?
Yeah, well, can we define identity? I think it's probably a good place to start. If you wouldn't mind, I think that would be a good place for us to start, because I thought when we were talking about this in the first place, what can we talk about? What sort of can I give some light on? And I think identity is really one of those areas that really is a hot topic. People do think about things like critical race theory and racial identity. Obviously, they'll talk about their sexual identity, their gender, their occupation. All of those things are all pointing to one particular area, which is your identity. So I think that identity, we need to think about what that is. And for me, well, just looking quickly at the definition of identity, it says the fact of being who or what a person or thing is. That's what an identity is. So there's that old saying, I think, therefore I am, which effectively gives basis for identity. So identity is sort of wrapped up in our reputation. It's what we think about ourselves. And obviously I'm a priest, and what we find in the Bible is a succession of a majority of narratives, which are stories, continually in the Bible. That's one of the biggest types of books in the Bible there are about narratives. This is what happened, and then this happened, and this happened. It's a narrative. Why that's important when it comes to identity is that we tell ourselves stories. That's how we live effectively, and that's how we build our identity. So yeah.
And I believe also there's something regarding, thinking about identity. You mentioned critical race theory, for example, and gender. And we know that's not something that's unique to an individual. We have groups, just as we have cultures that have particular characteristics. So is it fair to say that identity could be essentially being unique on one hand, but then on the other being similar to others?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you nailed the rod on the head there, Cheryl. I think that identity is a weird thing because we all know we are unique. All 8.5 billion of us are unique. but we also gravitate to and seek to find our way in the world. And so if you were going to look at chickens, you'd say the pecking order, like which chicken is more important than the other chickens or who they defer to and such. In wolf packs, we've often talked about alpha males, alpha females and things like that. And we know that that role changes within a pack. When it comes to ourselves and our identity, and it's so vital for a human being in their growth to form their own identity and work out who they are. That's really something that's can affect so much of their lives, especially when you have people who have roles in society where they might even call it a calling, but you might even have it where people say, no, I really feel like I was born to do this. I was born to be a carpenter, or I was born to surf, or whatever. You know, I was born to do this. That's part of my identity, and that's all well and good, of course, as long as you have the capacity to do that. But of course, the other part of it is if you have some sort of a crisis that stops you from doing that, are you still that, even though you don't do that? I think that's an important part for us to think about with identity. So taking into consideration somebody who was a great surfer, then they have an accident and they're not able to surf anymore. Is that person still a surfer or a footballer or a barrister? You know, are you still those things if you no longer have the capacity to do it, or even if you don't do it anymore, are you still that?
Yes, I dated an actor once, and when his show got cancelled, he had a crisis of identity because he wasn't that character as that actor in that show, and he didn't know who he was.
Yeah, I imagine that would be really, really traumatic, especially if you've given yourself over into that so much. So many times actors we do see where they really identify with that role, or even if they don't, but they're recognized constantly as that person. Oh, you're that person, you're that person. It's like, no, it's not me. It's just the role I play. But if that season or that series or whatever goes on for so long, you end up getting trapped in that. And it can get it can get really hard to try and reinvent yourself. Or I've been typecast as that particular role. I'm the mean person, or whatever, because I'm so well known as being that. And which part of that identity or persona or mask do you wear, and how exactly do you take that off again, and not bring it home to your family or your friends or anything else like that? It can be really hard.
Yeah, that's interesting. I learned from an expert in personalities and so forth from the States, saying that one of the great talents of actors is not so much their acting, it's what happens prior to, and that is doing the research and getting to know the identity of the character that they're playing. And so they actually do become that person in order to complete that, you know, that role effectively.
Yeah,
so
that method acting, can really be
fascinating, isn't it?
Let's take it a step further in the sense that I think that as we're growing up, because we're such sponges and we create, our personality gets created almost for us in response to our environment and our genetics, but largely to our environment, that we can get trapped in that identity. And growing up means keeping some and rejecting other elements of us to actually create the identity that we choose, rather than the identity we're kind of given from our environment, would you say?
Yeah, no, very much true. And it's vitally important when it comes to that. There is that whole nature versus nurture, or am I born with this typology? Is it my genetics, or is it my environment? Depending on who you speak to, they'll give you those types of answers of what they feel is more predominant in that space. Personally, myself, I can tell you that I believe it's got more to do with environment than it does with your genetics. But that may not necessarily be the case when it comes to sports, for argument's sake. If you're 7'3", remarkably lean, got good eye and hand coordination, and are in a part of the area or part of the world where basketball is the standard thing, probably you're going to be good at it, I would think. So yeah, you kind of get typecast in that space, but because of your identity, or sorry, because of your biology, you're going to be particularly much better off than somebody who's 5'2". So yeah.
It's a bit of that gifted and talented, isn't it? You know,
Correct,
you
yeah.
have both. But taking Dale's point further, where does story come into this? You know, you talk about nature and nurture, and then as Dale said, you know, making sure you still evolve as to who you are, not what you're expected to be. Story comes into play there. So, you know, an incident happens, and therefore this is the event. But then there's a story that goes with it. So how much do you think we become the story more than the actual event or experience?
Yeah, there is a theory that goes that the music makes the dancer. So you'll get yourself into a position where under a certain set of circumstances, you will behave in that way, even if it's something that's totally alien to you. You get led along in that space, and you end up in a awkward position potentially, just because of what's going on around you and what's led you in that space. It can be really quite difficult to break out of that. There are some ways of doing it, but a lot of them involve cognitive ability. You need to recognize, hang on a second, I didn't sign up for this, and where are the exits? You know, those types of things is vitally important to be able to break out of that. But sometimes the music does make the dancer. That's just the way it goes. Yeah.
And what would be your message to young people as a really healthy way to approach their identity?
Well, obviously I'm biased, but I would argue that it is vital for your personal growth to recognize a few different things that are going on when it comes to your identity. Can I perhaps take a step back and sort of qualify my answer before I sort of jump into it, though? With the since probably the 60s and certainly the 50s, 1950s, 1960s, there's been a real push in developed countries, developed nations, Western culture, if you like, to really re-identify what it is to be in those cultures. So what is it to be a man? What is it to be an Australian woman? What is it to be a soccer mum? You know, these types of things, these labels bring to mind certain stereotypes, and stereotypes are parts of story, of course. So when you think about those things, we need to think about, because effectively it is our reputation. That's what our identity is. All is not lost if you do something that is counterintuitive to your own story, but sometimes you need to pay the cost of those things, and sometimes you need to buy yourself back or redeem yourself, show yourself to not be a person who has that as part of their character. So for argument's sake, if you end up with the wrong crowd at some stage and everybody else is smoking, so you will too, or a certain crowd that you're in, people shoplift, and so you shoplift as well. There can be a cognitive disassociation when you might sit back that night and think, what have I done? Like, I'm better than that. Or even you might have an elder or a person in your family say to you, we've heard this is what you've done. You've started smoking. I'm really sorry that that's happened. I'm really ashamed of that, or whatever. And that whole shame issue kicks in, and you start thinking, what will I do? Will I now rebel against that elder person, or will I rebel against that culture that led me into that? So all of these things are really important. So your question, Dale, was what advice would I give to a younger person? The advice I would say is be careful with your character, because effectively it is the only thing you have. Everything else is by the by. We get older, we get really older sometimes. We can get sick, we can get healthy, all those different things. It's not even so much as being a good person, because sometimes you can go out of your way to be known as a good person without actually putting in the hard work to be one. But it is important, I think, to develop a strong character that will get you through those difficult times. So I think that's the biggest piece of advice I would give to a young person when it comes to identity.
Wonderful. So what, Jim, is the meaning of life?
Yeah, the meaning of life. Well, again, I do have to give my bias away. I am an Anglican priest, so that means I'm a Protestant. I would say that the best way you can find your identity is find your identity in Christ. There is an idea in Christian thought and theology that to become more and more of ourselves, to find our liberation and freedom, is to really follow after Jesus. That's really how we can do that. They call it Christoformity or those type of words. So it's to try and develop yourself closer and closer to that. And that's a really important way of looking at things. And that will certainly help you identify and develop your character. If you can conform yourself to be more and more like Jesus, that is one way of building up a certain robustness. Because if you do, for argument's sake, if you honestly do embrace that as an idea, what will happen is you will run up against people, potentially even in your church, who will say, I've heard you did that. That doesn't sound very Christian to me. And if you've truly been doing your best to be Christoformed, that won't even matter to you. It won't even be a blip on your radar, because they weren't where you were, and they weren't given the set of circumstances that you were. And so that's up to them. What they've got to do in their story and what they might do about these things is up to them. But you've got control over your own story, and whatever you do about that is how you'll build your own character. You need to be able to withstand those type of storms. So, yeah.
Sounds like it's a way to create resilience.
Yes. And resilience, I would argue, is probably one of the most important characteristics we can as humans have. You do need to be able to have resilience. Otherwise, you'll run into a drama of some type and then not be able to deal with it, because you don't have the character to deal with it. So, yeah, resilience is important.
So when I'm listening to what you're saying there about getting closer to Jesus and so forth, the word that comes up for me is oneness.
Mm-hmm.
And so where does that fit within the context of identity?
Sure.
In terms of what we said earlier around sameness but different.
Sure. So there is a word that's been invented. It's in the English language, but it's an invented word. It's 3 words put together. It's atonement. Atonement means at one-ment. That's what it actually means. So we are being atoned. We are being brought together with God. And sometimes if you pursue Jesus and pursue God as your identity, then what you can do is sometimes you'll end up in a situation where you're being brought away from that, from either your own circumstances or circumstances you find yourselves into, choices you've made or choices that have been made for you can draw you away from that. At those times, you need atonement. You need to be brought back.
That's fabulous, because that gives a very clear distinction. I'm very much of the view that all that we discuss and all that we work towards collectively begins with a shared language of agreement. Mm-hmm. And so to be able to distinguish between that oneness and atonement really enables that distinction between things like global community and, one world order and wanting to be, unique nation, state, country, et cetera, et cetera. So atonement, I think, would be a word, in my view, that needs to be celebrated and understood a lot more. How do you use that term more broadly across your life? So
atonement is something we do as part of a church service. So we would typically do communion or Lord's Supper, or whatever you prefer to call it, the Eucharist, depending on which side of the river you come from. But that's part of the atonement. So you would do it not by yourself. You would do it as part of a collective, a church community. So you would come in, you would do a church service, you would gather around together, and depending on, again, which part of the river you come from, which side of the bank you come from, there would be a service or part of that sacred space that you'll go through these things. So you'll say, this is the body of Christ, this is the blood of the new covenant. You would celebrate that together, and you would all, as a collective body, share that same bread and that same wine together. That is atonement, that is one-ment. So you individually are collectively becoming one with God. That's how that service goes, which is another reason why you might want to consider going to church. Can't help to throw that in.
So then once we've got our community, what's interesting is the issue around Christianity.
Mhm.
And how we have, our Anglicans and our, Catholics and so many other
Different
elements.
flavours, yes.
Yes, different flavors. Thank you. Different flavors of Christianity. So how do we actually bring Christianity together that it is a celebration rather than this curious quest for determining and holding on to difference?
Yeah, I've been discussing that very thing with one of my very good friends up here. I'm in Surfers Paradise, and we've just thought I'd throw that in again. We've been talking about that a little bit because what the issue can be that you can be friends with somebody and they say, you should come to my church. That gives me such a oneness. I feel so complete and uplifted, and I'll go to a service and it resets everything for me. It's like having 100 massages or, those type of things. It can be so edifying. And you think, great, you haven't oversold it to me at all. I'll definitely go to that. You go there and you think, 5 minutes in, you think, has it been 3 hours yet? This is agonizing. I don't know how much longer of this I can take. Oh, hang on, he's going to go for something else, or she's going to do this. And you can have two people who are good friends, know each other quite well, having two very different experiences. So I actually celebrate the diversity of Christendom. I think it's really important for us to have that. I've got friends who are Greek Orthodox. I've got friends who are Roman Catholic. I've got friends who are not Christian at all. We all find our own ways in this life. But I think when it comes to Christianity or Orthodoxy or Catholicism or any part of Christianity at all you might want to consider, it's whatever is right for you at that time that you can actually experience that does bring you closer to God. Because again, getting back to that identity question, we have a personal identity, but we have a collective identity as well. And that's something we need to be really clear about. So there's the idea of tribalism. Which tribe do you belong in? What football team do you barrack for? What coffee shops do you prefer to go to? Any of those type of things can define your tribalism, but we still like to be individual in different ways as well. And so that's why I think when it comes to Christianity and belief structures, it is important to find the way that works best for you. Because otherwise, I'm not talking about a season. Sometimes we can go through a season of just dryness, where what was really uplifting and edifying for you at a different stage of your life is really not like that at all. Well, you can be a time where you just need to push through that and you will redefine again. But there can be other times when it's just like, no, you do need to explore a different type of Christianity, a different branch perhaps, and that can be worthwhile. We're certainly seeing that since COVID, a lot of us who are a lot more Orthodox are seeing people who were identifying themselves as a little bit more either charismatic or Pentecostal are coming to much more Orthodox churches. And it's because of, I believe it's because of going through a season of punishment and dryness of the lockdowns and pandemics that we've been experiencing has just challenged our identity. And some of those, I'm not trying to say anything negative about different branches, but some of those types of Christianity can really talk about God loves you and he wants to bless you in this life with so many blessings. And that could sound great. It's a very easy message to hear, but that's all well and good until such time as you hit the wall of something that doesn't really feel like a blessing. And you think, hang on a second, what have I done? Doesn't God love me? And that can cause you an identity crisis right there. So, yeah.
So, Jim, with Australia, Australia is based on certain values, and we have in our culture we do have certain values that we adopt and live out as a collective. Would you say that there are Christian values that Australians live by but don't call them Christian values?
Oh, certainly that's the case. Almost positively that's the case. I would argue that Australia never really was a Christian country, and I've even written a thesis about that. But perhaps a story for a different time. But I think there's enough evidence to show that we have, as a people, have had Christianity imposed upon us through a very specific lens, and that's one case in that was really quite interesting, and the reason how Roman Catholicism came to Australia. So Roman Catholicism came to Australia because of the predominantly Irish Catholics who had been arrested and convicted and sent as convicts here to Australia. And the Anglican priests who were there, who were ministering to them, just were finding it wasn't possible for them. They couldn't give them the communion. They couldn't give them the service. And there actually arose among their own member, one of the convicts who had become emancipated. He became a Roman Catholic priest. And that actually caused some other priests, some other Anglican priests, to send back to Britain and ask for more Roman Catholics to come here, because we just can't help them. They need to have their own people here. And I think that's a really encouraging part of Australian church history, is that we recognise that, and we didn't just go, no, here's our opportunity, we'll stamp it out. We'll force them to become Anglican. That's how we'll stamp out this scourge of Roman Catholicism. So there is that in our history. I think the other part is, of course, that the part of Anglicanism where it comes to Australian law. So in the early days, or certainly the early days of Australia, a priest was also a local magistrate. So you could be effectively, even times with John Wesley and such, when he went to America, he went there as an Anglican priest, but he was also the local magistrate. And it's hard to be in those circumstances where you're trying to give a loving, blessing message. But when the law or the time is a little bit more corrupt, or certainly skewed, when you're having to have people flogged and then you're expecting to see them in church that following Sunday, it can be a little bit hard to hear, and probably not the best way of getting people to go along to church, or at least hear that God does in fact love them. So, yeah.
So you've got two elements there that I'm curious about. The first one, clearly there's a conflict there. There wasn't the separation of church and state that we talk about, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that, as you're saying there, that these priests also had to be, judge and jury. They had to adopt an adversarial approach to something that they wouldn't, to an issue that, had they have not been in that position, they would use a completely different strategy.
That's true. That's right. And even there's been some priests who gave up their vows simply for that reason. They felt that they couldn't maintain both positions. One position as being a magistrate, and then another position as being a pastor to the people who they were trying to reach. But just on the earlier point you just mentioned there, Cheryl, just the separation of church and state doesn't actually mean what we think of in common language as meaning that. So the term comes from the United States, and it was, I believe, Jefferson who came up with that as a terminology. But it was to entice the Baptists to re-engage with the country that was being formed. And they were assuring them that their religion was not going to, well, it might have been the Mormons, their religion was not going to be an issue. There was going to be a separation of the church and state from that. They weren't going to be enforced to be that. But at no stage was it ever really meant that the religion was supposed to be separate and distinctly different from politics. It's always been part of politics from the last 2,000 years. It's always been political. So yeah, that's a bit of a misnomer, and it's one that's sort of snuck in there, that people like to think that, well, you can't be a Christian or a politician. Which one do you want to be most? Well, certainly you can be both.
Exactly, and it's sort of a bit like that whole conflict of interest concept, isn't it? So you've just nailed it there. Who am I today? Am I the pastor, or am I the politician?
Yeah.
So would you call that a bit of an identity crisis?
Yes, I think it probably would be. It is quite sad, and it's not all that uncommon that there are people who do feel that I'm a Christian on Sunday, but the other days I've got to put these other things on because there are compromises I need to make in life to get through, and that's really quite sad. That is something that people do. I would hope that they can integrate the whole of their life into ways of exhibiting their faith. Otherwise, you end up in a position where you become a hypocrite, and that's the last thing you would want to be. That again, it affects your identity. It can cause you to have your own identity crisis, and that's not a good place to be.
And Jim, with the values that are in us because God put them there, that non-believers or atheists or secular people adopt as if they're their own, which when they really come from God.
Yeah, well, there are parts I would argue do come from God. There are parts that come from our own biology, and there are parts that come from the society in which we live. And it is interesting to me that it's been for a number of decades now a noticeable trend where you can have a person who through kindergarten, through primary school, through high school has been Christian. They go to university and less than half of them emerge from university still being Christian. Now, if you were of a certain mindset, you might think that's because they've started to think for themselves now, rather than just being locked into their ideology of what they were sort of hoodwinked into believing when they couldn't think straight for themselves. Well, it's a cynical way of thinking, but I think it's a wrong way of thinking. But I do think that it's actually evidence of the culture at work. The culture of the university is to push you away from Christianity as a belief system, whereas it shouldn't. I would argue that if I just want to learn how to be a vet, why is my faith an issue to you? Why am I constantly being asked to question my faith in order to do that particular job, or an engineer or a doctor? Why is that causing you issue? Even more so from a Christian perspective is that we've got quite a robust series of tradition and examples. There have been throughout history Christian scientists, Christian doctors, that never caused them issue. Then why is it more recently? Why has it been over the last 50, 60, 70 years that we start hearing those things as being non-compatible?
It leads me a little bit to a question Dale was asking earlier around Australia, and perhaps I could come back to that if you don't mind.
Of course.
Two questions. The first one I'll ask you is, what do you think Australia's identity is?
Yeah, well, I think that's $1 million question. And I can tell you that I don't think Australia knows what its identity is. If I was going to be a conspiracy theorist, I would suggest to you that I think there are outside forces that are trying to maintain this imbalance in Australian culture, where we are constantly out of kilter and wandering around in the dark trying to find out who we are as a collective people. There's been so many books that have been written about that very thing, cultural calamity, and it's been, again, since, I would argue, since the 60s. And it's when we start removing fences that were already there without actually asking why those fences were there in the first place, that we start ending up in this space where we're sort of wandering around going, hang on, why are you in my paddock? Well, that's not your paddock, that's my paddock. Well, hang on, I think it's always been my paddock. No, it's not. And because if we just rip down those fences without actually stopping to think, should we pull these down? What else are we going to put up in place of them to stop these things from potentially being an issue? Or, you know, we just want to burn everything because anarchism is the way we want to run with things, and that's all well and good. But in all that chaos in anarchism, it's the people who are already poor, the people who are already open to suffering, they're the ones who suffer the most. The ones who are already actually victims are the ones who suffer the most in those type of societies, rather than those who are the top level who always seem to manage to bounce from one thing to another. So
the analogy that you made of the fences there, terrific segue to question number 2.
Sure.
And and I'm thinking, you've mentioned a couple of times 60, 70 years ago. I'm wondering what your views are around Australia's identity due to the mass immigration that we've had post Second World War, and our, I suppose, naivety in not being prepared for the diversity that came into our country and continues to come in. What do you think, that sort of movement has, what sort of impact that has had on Australia's identity?
Yeah, I think it has. Definitely it has. It was always going to happen, and I can't say that I really agree at all with the White Australia policy, which was a policy that we had for quite a long time, which kept everybody out who didn't come from a European background, kept them out of Australia effectively. Until the 70s, then an Act of Parliament, 1975 or thereabouts, was the final closing of that. It was last century that we did progress to that stage, but it was finally in the Whitlam government that we officially got rid of the rest of those things. And then from that point, we did get a lot more people come in. And that's great. I love multiculturalism. I really do. I think we all benefit as a culture significantly because of multiculturalism. But it does call into question, what is it to be an Australian? And it's okay to say that we are not this. Okay, if you're not that, what are you? And it's not usually the diametrically opposed opposite of what you're not. That doesn't tell you what you are, but it can give you some indications, or at least it can give you some sore points of what you are definitely not. I think it's not just an Australian culture. I don't mean to digress too much, but it's not just an Australian culture, but it's in developed world culture as a general dislike to be thought of as being an ist of any kind. So whether you are a racist or a sexist or a misogynist, nobody wants to be those things. But it is important for us to identify the positive. Okay, you're not that. Okay, that's great. If you met somebody at a party and you're just going up and saying, "G'day, how are you?" And yeah, good, thanks. So what are you? Well, I'm not a racist. Well, great. I'm glad we cleared that one up. What else? Well, I'm not a misogynist. Good, thank you. Just wondering what it is you do. Well, I don't do this. Well, okay, great. Can you please tell me something positive that you do? And I think that's really something that we aren't collectively doing, certainly not very well as a culture in Australia. And again, that's something that's been lamented by so many authors over so long a time. We're so busy pushing back against what we see as being the old structures. We're fighting against those things without actually moving towards or giving positive examples of what we actually are. And I think until we can start doing that, we as a country are going to continue to suffer. We do need strong leadership in this country. And by that, I don't mean often when people say I want a strong leader, what they really mean is I want somebody who will tell everybody else to do what I think they should do. That's strong leadership. Well, that's great. That's not necessarily strong leadership. Strong leadership is choosing the right thing, even if it's not the most popular thing. And the problem is with politics is it's a popularity contest. You've got to constantly be doing the popular thing, or at least be seen to do the popular thing, which gives rise to things like virtue signaling and things like that. Tokenism is just that. It's pointless. It means nothing. But to build a strong character, to build a strong identity, I think to build a strong identity as a culture, as Australians, starts with individuals. We need to start stepping in and saying, rather than saying what we're not, we need to start saying what we are. And one way you can do that is to just blanketly ignore any of the isms that might come your way when people try to label you, because effectively what they are doing is bullying you. They are bullying you into doing what they want you to do, to be pigeonholed into a thing. So once they can pigeonhole you, they can dismiss you, or they can force you to comply with what they want you to do. Or you can grow a backbone and work on your own identity and build up your own character to say, I'm just not interested in that. Thanks very much. maybe try the house down the road.
That's really interesting because, you know, creating your own identity and being clear about that and being confident to stand, you know, on your own 2 feet in comfortable shoes requires that education. And what was coming to mind for me when you were talking just then was the issue around the refugee intake that we have, and certainly that's happening around the world as well, and the confusion between you know, comments being made or assimilation being attempted, that people are, you know, you talk about ism, people are racist and it's all about racism, when in fact perhaps it's a religious confusion that's causing people to have some discontent. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think that there's quite a lot of issues in that space. Even the refugee issue is one that's just fraught with so much danger. I think that one of the big issues there, because I've spent a lot of time with asylum seekers, one of the big issues that is largely ignored when it comes to discussion about asylum seekers is that they actually don't want to be here. Even if, for argument's sake, Australia is the best country for that person to be in because we've got safety and medical care and all those different things, all the things that are fleeing from the country to be into, the ordeal that they've gone through of even having to leave their country land, their homeland, most of those people, the vast majority of people that I've certainly spoken to who are asylum seekers, actually want to go back. It's just not safe for them to do that. And so I think it's really important for us to recognise that, because so often you can get into this space where you think, oh, they'll come here and they'll take our jobs, they'll affect our culture, they'll make it so our cities aren't livable, they'll do all these different things. And okay, they may even be true. And I don't have a dog either way in that race, but that's not really the argument. The argument is these are people who are suffering, who do need to be cared for. And then when it's safe to do so, they actually want to go home again, and we should help them do that, but only when it's safe for them to do so. Sadly, I've known quite a few who have done that, who have gone through the system, and then somebody somewhere decides that their country is safe. They send them back again. And unfortunately, those people are no longer with us. They die. That's obviously terrible. So I don't know if I answered your question there, Cheryl. But
it's great. Dale, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was thinking that maybe this whole racist name calling is a barrier to us creating solutions, because maybe these people would like to be in their own community. Maybe they don't want to totally assimilate into the country.
Not at all.
Maybe
not at all. And even the ones who do, even the ones who do, when I say that, I mean the ones who do set up home and make this place their home, you'll often find that they'll long for their homeland. And that can be really hard. I've had friends that have done that, who have come out, their country was really, really hard for them to be in. They came to Australia, they spent time here, and then when their country was safe for them to go back to, they went back to there. But then they had this split heart. They had their memories when they were here of their homeland of being so great. And then when they went back to that homeland, it wasn't anything like they had. And then they have these great memories of Australia, which of course is just rose-colored glasses. Our ultimate, I'm obviously biased in this space, but our ultimate home has not been revealed to us. Our ultimate home is in heaven. That's really where we belong. And we won't really find our true identity, our true home, until we get there. So we're all effectively refugees until that point.
Nice. And what's something new that you've learnt recently, Jim?
Well, if we're talking in this space, I would say there's actually so much in this space. There's so much where people are talking about this a lot. One of my old principals of a college that I used to attend, Brian Rosner's really recently brought out a book talking about identity and finding ourselves, finding our identity. And that's, I really advocate that. If you were going to look for a book or talk about something that you might find as new, His book is called How to Find Yourself by Brian Rosner. That's only a fairly recent publication. But yeah, I think it's really important and to do that, to find your identity and do that in that space. And that's something that I've really been working on a little bit more this year. That's something new that I found.
And you're finding at work that you're experiencing more and more people wanting to have conversations with you about their need to find their identity and perhaps the confusion that some people are going through in this context?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I don't think people tend to phrase it in that way, but certainly that's what I hear when they speak to me about a particular problem. So usually if somebody talks to me about something like that, or they want to speak to me about something that when that's not my sermon from the weekend, but usually if it's something else they want to speak to me about, it's usually a crisis that they've been dealing with of some type, that they've effectively found that they've painted themselves into a corner, and they feel that there's no way out. And that can be a really terrible place to be in. And my role in that space is to journey with somebody and potentially sit in that corner with them and say, how are we going to get ourselves out of here, and potentially we're not going to do it straight away. Sometimes the best thing we can do in that space is to really identify it as being a place of suffering and pain, and a place that's not great to be in, and gradually build ourselves a pathway out of that together. That's a great journey to go on with somebody. Not one when you're constantly providing the answers, but one where you're saying, well, what are we going to do? Where are we going to get out through this? That can be great. And those are the stories that make for better stories on into the future. Because once you've solved your own, or one of your identity crises, and we constantly do, from the moment we're born, we have an identity crisis. Hang on, what's this whole breathing thing I've got to do? I didn't have to do that in the womb. What's up with that? This is dry. This is not fun at all. We've got to deal with that. That's our first identity crisis, and then when we come to the realization that I'm not the center of the universe, I've got that identity crisis. So there's any number of things, but once we identify that we can get ourselves out of those painted in corners, it actually builds our own story. I'm a survivor. I'm somebody who does those things. I can push myself out of those things. Not that I might want to do it straight away, but I can take confidence that I am going to find my way out of this. This is just a momentary crisis that I'm going through.
That's powerful. That's extremely powerful. I had a thought bubble then when you were saying that of, for example, Dad says to his daughter, "Oh, hi, Tubby, good to see you, tonight." And so this girl has this identity crisis that, Dad thinks she's fat, but that's, essentially a nickname that he's given her out of love and affection. So she spends her life going through this identity bubble, thinking that she's fat and not accepted by her dad, or not as good as she could be. And so, she's got these green coloured lenses on when the world is really red.
That's right. It's even worse so when that becomes the nickname, when you become Tubby Jim, when that type of thing happens to you, and it's just like, oh, it's just my nickname. But it can be terrible. You've actually hit a trigger item for me. I only found out maybe a decade ago that children can't process sarcasm until they're at least 14. What they'll take at that point is anything you say to them, no matter the tone of voice you use, they'll take it literally. So they'll either disagree with it or agree with it, but they'll at least take it as a fact that you're saying those type of things to you. So when you're a parent, or even as an elder or a person with authority speaking to somebody who is young as life, we've got to really take that quite seriously. And it's one of the great regrets of my life is where I would often go for the joke. When I would say something, I don't think I ever called any of my daughters ugly, but I would say something potentially about them not looking as good or whatever. But I would go do it for A, for laughs, but B, because it was so obvious certainly to me, obviously wrong. That's why it's funny. But unfortunately, children don't hear that. They hear that this person who has the ability of approving or disapproving in their life says this thing about them. There was another book, if you want to consider it, if you haven't read it already, is The 5 Love Languages by Dr. Gary Chapman. He talks about every time you say something like that to somebody, every time you say something that may even be perceived as negative, even if you don't mean it that way, you must immediately say 5 positive things. And that's really difficult to do as somebody who's tried to do that, especially if my life has been one. I came from parents who taught me to have a lot of concrete and toughening up in my early formative years, and unfortunately it's turned out with quite a few negative habits, and one of them is speaking negatively and sarcastically and sardonically. Those type of things are a coping mechanism, and it does limit you from actually stepping up into a different part of life. But yeah, every time you try to say something negative or find yourself saying something negative, even if it is to yourself, you should immediately try to find 5 positive things. That can be remarkably hard, but once you do that, especially if those 5 things are true things, you can't just go, "You're fantastic," or "You're a unicorn," or whatever. You can't say those things. You need to say 5 positive things that are actually true. Remarkably hard, but infinitely better for your self-growth.
I love that. I love that. I'm a bit disappointed because I really do see myself as a unicorn, so that's a bit disappointing. But I know what you're saying. I think my whole raising of my child was a bit an experiment. I think parenting is an experiment. But at one stage, I don't know where I got it from, but I started calling him Trouble. And because it was kind of funny, I think someone else was doing it or something, and I was just going, "No, Trouble," and I just called him that. And in a really short amount of time, he started playing up. Like it was distinct. I started doing that, and I don't know, within a week or something, it was like really short amount of time, he just started behaving really badly. So then I started calling him Angel. And then, which really set me up in his teenage years when he clearly was not behaving like an angel, to keep that going. So my image of him then was constant, irrespective of his behavior. And he did tend to live up to that. But that short amount of time when I did that just was so obvious.
Positive reinforcement is vitally important. Yeah.
It's funny, with raising my 2 girls, identity's been central to our life. I adopted my girls, so I have one from Thailand and one from Hong Kong. And so their identity has always been something that we've talked openly about in terms of their physical appearance and so forth. And what I learned very quickly, I don't know where this came from, as you said, Dale, with your parenting issue there. I started saying to my daughters, or my oldest one, when she asked some questions, particularly around who she was and who she was becoming, I'd say to her, that's a really great question. You're 10 years old and you've asked this really powerful question. It's really something that, a 12-year-old would ask. You're so clever. So when you're 12, ask me then, because I only know how to be a mum to a 10-year-old. I'm learning, I have to learn to become a mum to a 12-year-old as well. And that sort of helped alleviate a lot of some of the challenges with identity. So I think, Dale, as you said, as parents, we're forever evolving and our identity is forever changing through our parenting life.
Yeah, very much true. Yeah.
Beautiful. So, Jim, what would you do if you were the boss of Australia?
We don't want me to be boss of Australia. Very, very clearly.
I do.
Well, for one thing, it'd be a theocracy, and that's never actually turned out to be a good thing throughout history. So I don't know that it necessarily would be a good idea. I think they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So I definitely would not want to be the ruler of Australia, not at all. If, however, I was, so I'm not trying to avoid the question, I guess I will have to try and answer it. I think one of the first things that I would do is to do exactly what we've been talking about here, is to work on our national identity. I think it's vitally important. I think it's something that we need to identify. And we can, there are little indicators. Australian culture does rise to the fore in different areas. You can see it on Anzac Day. You can see it on a public holiday. There are certain things that are just Australian, but given the challenges we've had in dismantling the structures of the past with the various different immigrant migrations into the country, all of those things have challenged what we think of ourselves, and that is something we really need to work on. And until we can really come up with a national identity, I think we'll continue to suffer, and not in good ways. I think it's something that we really do need to do. So there you go. That's my answer. If I was ruler of Australia, I would work on our national identity.
It's extremely powerful, and I have no doubt there would be millions of people that would agree with you. And the challenge is then, of course, that probably everyone would then be arguing over what that really was. And so on the cycle goes. So what a fascinating opportunity. I'll vote for you.
Please don't.
Well, do you think that if we don't define our identity, we will just be following America for the rest of for eternity? Do you think we follow America, and do you think that that would be a disaster if we keep doing it?
Yeah, I don't even know that it's following America. I think it's following the next most shiny thing. We do tend to follow. If you don't know where you're doing, you tend to follow what other people are doing. The pandemic's a good example of this. So why did the world all decide that it was time to vaccinate and lock down? Well, why did we do that collectively as a species? Well, we all did it because one country somewhere decided this is what we'll do, and then the others all followed suit like dominoes. So I think that it's important for us to be clear about who we are. There are issues such as our nation's security when it comes to sovereignty of our waters and our lands. I don't think it's any great surprise to suggest that we can't defend ourselves, not effectively, certainly not against a superior force. We're highly undermanned in that space. As a country where for the land mass only, we're significantly underpopulated. But the issue is the majority of us live close to the ocean, and there's not that many of us who live in the central parts, and the majority of this country is the central parts. So there's a whole lot of space that we need to think about in that topic. So yeah.
Well, this has been fabulous. Thank you for an extraordinary conversation. And, we could talk for another hour and we wouldn't even scratch the surface. It's been wonderful.
Thanks, Cheryl. Well, I feel the same way. It's been good to beat around on a topic that I particularly feel quite passionate about. Our identity is something that we really need to work on. Well,
at the taking the risk of embarrassing you outrageously, you are a hero of mine, and I do look up to you, and so I feel so blessed that you would chat to us.
Anytime. I'm always up for a chat.
Excellent.
Thank you.